Dust tastes like old pennies and rusted iron. 13 of the deadliest triggers on the planet just walked away from the firing mat with bruised egos and ringing ears. 4,000 meters. An impossible distance where wind literally eats bullets. They all missed. Then, the ghost stepped up. 4,000 meters isn't a distance. It's a completely different time zone. When you send a piece of machined copper and lead across 2.5 miles of open air, you aren't just shooting. You are arguing with gravity, negotiating with barometric pressure, and begging the wind for a favor. A bullet in flight for over 10 seconds doesn't just drop, it drifts. It gets pushed by the rotation of the earth. If a butterfly flaps its wings in the valley below, your shot misses by 6 feet. Harper hated the valley. She sat on a dented green ammo can in the shadow of a canvas awning, peeling a strip of olive drab 100-mile tape off her knuckles. Her head throbbed. The caffeine withdrawal was a dull, rhythmic spike, driving itself behind her left eye, syncing perfectly with the concussive blasts of heavy-caliber rifles. 13 men were gathered around the firing line. JSOC, SAS, a couple of highly classified contractors who wore sterile gear and expensive sunglasses. This was supposed to be an exhibition. A proving ground for a new, experimental CHATAC 408 platform, built specifically to push the absolute limits of human ballistics. The brass had brought them out to this nameless, high-altitude range in the jagged teeth of the Rockies to see who could make history. So far, history was winning.
"Send it,"
Kinsley muttered. He was on the glass, a massive spotting scope mounted on a tripod, his eye pressed into the rubber cup. Beside him on the mat, Donovan exhaled. Donovan was a ranger sniper, built like a brick wall, usually possessing the pulse of a hibernating bear. But right now, a bead of sweat was actively carving a pale line through the dirt on his neck. The rifle roared. It wasn't a pop. It was a physical assault. The muzzle brake violently vented, expanding gases backward and to the sides, kicking up a furious cloud of pulverized limestone and sagebrush. Harper didn't flinch. She just let the grit settle against her damp collar, savoring the acrid metallic smell of burnt smokeless powder. It smelled like every bad day she'd ever had in Kandahar, wrapped in a blanket of cold mountain air. Silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 5, 8. You could feel the collective breath holding. The men stood with their arms crossed, staring out at the expanse of nothingness. Across the jagged canyon, invisible to the naked eye, a steel plate the size of a standard door was bolted to a rock face. 10 seconds. Impact, Kinsley said, his voice flat. Dirt. Low right. 4 mils. Donovan swore, slapping his hand against the rubberized grip of the rifle. Wind shifted. "Wind didn't shift, man," muttered Hayes, a Marine Scout sniper who was leaning against the tailgate of a muddy pickup truck. "You just misread the updraft coming off that limestone ridge." "You want to get down here and try it, Hayes?" Donovan snapped, rolling off the mat. His knees cracked loudly. "I already did, and I was closer than you." Harper rubbed her eyes, digging her thumbs into the sockets until bursts of static color flared in her vision. The testosterone was thick enough to choke on. They were all doing the same thing, overcompensating. When elite men fail at the one thing they are supposedly the best in the world at, they start looking for external variables to blame. The glass was miraging. The ammo was inconsistent. The barrel was too hot. The barrel was too cold. Nobody wanted to admit that 4,000 meters was just a mathematical nightmare. At that range, the target is smaller than the crosshair holding over it. You are aiming at empty space, trusting that the universe will push your bullet down into the steel exactly a decade of seconds later. She took a sip from her canteen. The water was lukewarm and tasted heavily of plastic. She swished it around her dry mouth and swallowed, feeling the rough slide of it down her throat. She was the only woman on the mountain. She hadn't been invited to shoot. She was technically here as a security element and technical observer for the Navy, a quiet addition to a very loud roster. When her commanding officer had told her to tag along, he'd pitched it as a vacation. "Go watch the boys measure themselves," he'd said. "Take notes." She hadn't fired a shot all morning. She just watched. She watched the way the Dust Devils danced in the valley, noting how they spun clockwise near the ridge but counterclockwise near the basin. She watched the sagebrush trembling in a cross-canyon breeze that the weather meters up at the firing line couldn't detect. She listened to the delay of the echoes, painting a mental map of the invisible air pressure zones between the firing line and the target. Who's next? Kinsley asked, rubbing his eye and stepping back from the spotting scope. Hayes stepped forward. He was number 13. He dropped onto the mat with practiced, aggressive grace, settling his weight behind the massive weapon system. He didn't adjust the bipod. A rookie mistake, Harper noted silently. Donovan was heavier, wider. Hayes was shorter. The rifle wasn't seated perfectly in the pocket of his shoulder. He was going to muscle the recoil. "Give me the read, Kinsley," Hayes demanded. Kinsley leaned back into the glass. "Wind is coming left to right. Call it 5 miles an hour at the muzzle, but it looks like a dead zone at 2,000 meters. Mirage is running hard left at the target. Hold left edge, 2 mils high. Your funeral." Hayes worked the massive bolt. The metallic times, shuck-clack times, was incredibly loud in the thin air. He chambered around the size of a metal cigar. Harper watched his trigger finger. It was twitching, just slightly, a microscopic tremor. He was hyped up on adrenaline and pride. He wanted to be the one. He wanted the bragging rights. He fired. The pressure wave washed over Harper, fluttering the collar of her combat shirt. She didn't look at the valley. She just watched Hayes' shoulders. The moment the rifle fired, his right shoulder tensed, driving forward into the stock. Anticipation. 10 agonizing seconds ticked by. The wind howled through the canvas awning, a lonely whistling sound. "Miss," Kinsley called out, not even masking the exhaustion in his voice. "High and left. You chased the Mirage." Hayes slammed his fist into the mat, unleashing a string of expletives that echoed off the rocks. He didn't get up right away. He just lay there, forehead resting against the cold steel of the scope housing, breathing heavily. 13 shooters. 13 misses. The experimental Chaytak lay in the dirt like a stubborn mule that refused to be broken. "All right," Kinsley sighed, standing up and stretching his lower back. "That's it. Target's untouchable today. The thermals are completely blown out. We're just turning expensive brass into noise." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. The egos were suddenly comforted by the consensus of impossibility. If nobody could do it, then it wasn't a failure of skill. It was an act of God. The environment was simply too hostile. They began packing away their gear, zipping up drag bags and flicking half-smoked cigarettes into the dirt. Harper stood up. Her knees ached. A dull, grinding sensation in the cartilage from carrying 100 pounds of gear over too many mountains in too many bad time zones. She tossed the strip of olive drab tape onto the ammo can. Her boots crunched softly against the gravel. The sound was quiet, but in the lull of the retreating men, it drew eyes. She didn't look at them. She walked straight past Kinsley, past the murmuring crowd, and stopped directly behind the firing mat. "Let me handle that," she said. Her voice was raspy, cracked from disuse and the dry mountain air. It wasn't a request. It didn't carry the boastful swagger of Hayes or the gravelly authority of Donovan. It sounded like a mechanic stating they were going to change a tire. Hayes looked up from the mat, his face flushed. "Excuse me?" "Move." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. There was a dead, flat quality to her tone that made men who broke things for a living hesitate. Hayes scrambled off the mat, brushing dirt from his knees, his pride warring with his confusion. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the gathered operators. Kinsley frowned, his hand resting on the spotting scope. "Finley, right?" Kinsley said. "Look, no offense, but we're burning out the barrel on this thing. The wind is soup out there. It's a waste of ammo." "You have 3 rounds left in the box," Harper replied, her eyes fixed on the heavy rifle. She unvelcroed the cuffs of her jacket and rolled the sleeves up to her forearms. The skin was pale, mapped with faded white scars that looked like lightning strikes. "I only need 1. Someone in the back scoffed. A quiet, derogatory chuckle. Harper ignored it. She knelt beside the mat. The smell of haze was still on it, stale sweat, and the sharp, chemical tang of cheap deodorant. It annoyed her. She grabbed the edge of the mat and yanked it sideways, exposing the hard, packed earth beneath. She didn't want a soft cushion. Softness created bounce. Bounce created inconsistency. She lay down directly in the dirt. The ground was freezing. The cold immediately seeped through the fabric of her pants, biting into her hip bones and rib cage. She welcomed it. The cold was real. It chased away the dull throb in her head and brought her nervous system into sharp, agonizing focus. She reached out and pulled the massive 408 rifle toward her. It was heavy, awkwardly balanced, and still radiating heat from the previous shots. The stock was slick with someone else's palm sweat. She wiped it down callously with the sleeve of her jacket.
"You want a spotter?" Kinsley asked, his tone laced with skepticism.
No. You can't read the trace in the mirage by yourself at 4 clicks, Finley. It's not possible. I said no. She adjusted the bipod legs. Click, click. They were uneven. Hayes had been shooting on a slight cant. She leveled the rifle, pressing her weight forward, loading the bipod so the legs dug deep into the rocky soil. She wanted the earth to push back. She didn't look through the scope yet. She closed her eyes. Breathe in. Dust. Cordite. The metallic scent of the hot barrel. Breathe out. She opened her eyes and looked at the valley with her naked vision. She wasn't looking at the target, she was looking at the air. There was a patch of scrub oak 1,000 meters out. The leaves were silver-backed, flipping upwards, updraft. 2,000 meters out, a heat shimmer rose off a slab of granite, bending the light like warped glass. The shimmer was leaning right at a 15-degree angle. Crosswind, stronger than Kinsley had called it. 3,000 meters out, the canyon necked down, creating a funnel. The wind would accelerate there, creating a sudden vacuum on the backside of the ridge. 4,000 meters, the steel plate, invisible. She slid her face down onto the cheek rest of the stock. It was cold and hard against her jawbone. She kept both eyes open, aligning her right eye behind the ocular lens of the scope. The glass was immaculate, German-engineered clarity that suddenly pulled the distant world into brutal focus. The crosshairs were a thin black cross, floating over a hazy, vibrating landscape. She reached up with her left hand and grasped the elevation turret, the metal knurling bit into her calloused fingertips. She didn't look at the numbers. She knew the ballistics. Click, click, click. She was dialing up, way up. She had to launch this bullet in an artillery arc. It would reach an apex hundreds of feet above the line of sight before dropping back down toward the earth. Click, click, click. The men behind her were dead silent now. The mockery had faded, replaced by the tense, heavy atmosphere of morbid curiosity. They were waiting for her to fail. They wanted her to fail, because if she succeeded, their own failures would become permanent. She moved to the windage turret. Kinsley had called left to right. He was wrong. The aggregate wind across the entire flight path wasn't pushing right. The updraft in the funnel at 3,000 meters would counteract the initial drift. The bullet was going to surf a wave of pressure. She dialed 3 clicks left. An aggressive, counterintuitive hold. She settled her hand back onto a rear sandbag, squeezing it gently to make micro-adjustments to the elevation. The crosshairs drifted over the hazy gray square of the steel plate in the scope. She didn't aim at the center. She aimed high and left, hovering over completely empty space. To the untrained eye, she was pointing at a patch of brown rock 30 feet away from the target. Her heart beat against the dirt. Thump, thump. It was too fast. She closed her eyes behind the scope. She pictured the ice plunging into her veins. She slowed her breathing. 4 seconds in. Hold for 4. 4 seconds out. Hold for 4. The box breathing technique they drilled into you at Coronado until you could do it while drowning. Her heart rate dropped. Thump, thump. She opened her eye. The crosshair settled. A bead of sweat trickled down her forehead, stinging a small, raw scratch above her eyebrow. She didn't blink. She let it sting. The pain was an anchor. It kept her from floating away into the math. She slid her trigger finger inside the guard. The metal was freezing. She didn't curl the tip. She laid the pad of her index finger perfectly flat against the curved shoe of the trigger. Breathe in. The wind howled. Breathe out. She paused at the bottom of her breath. The natural respiratory pause. The empty space between life and death where the body is perfectly still. She didn't pull the trigger. She just let the weight of her finger increase, an imperceptible adding of ounces, letting the rifle decide when it was time to speak. Recoil hit her collarbone like a ball-peen hammer. The Chaytak. 408 didn't just fire, it detonated. A violent shockwave punched the breath out of her lungs and kicked a thick cloud of pulverized limestone straight into her open mouth. Grit coated her teeth. The sheer concussive force made her sinuses ring with a sharp, high-pitched whine. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She rode the violent buck of the rifle, burying her weight into the dirt to absorb the kinetic energy, forcing the crosshairs back down onto the target line before the barrel even stopped vibrating. She had to see the trace. If you know how to look, and if the atmospheric conditions are just right, you can physically see a bullet flying. It doesn't look like a projectile. It looks like a flaw in reality. The supersonic copper-solid round displaces the air so violently that it creates a tiny, swirling vortex of low pressure in its wake, bending the light. There it was, a microscopic, shimmering ripple arcing impossibly high into the blue void above the canyon. 1 second. The rifle's bolt was locked tight, hot against her cheek. Down in the valley, the wind howled through the scrub oak, indifferent to the piece of metal tearing through it at 3,000 feet per second. 3 seconds. Harper felt a familiar, ugly ache blooming in her lower spine. An old souvenir from a botched halo jump over the Syrian border. Her body was a roadmap of poorly healed fractures and torn cartilage. She was 32, but her skeleton felt 50. The men standing behind her, holding their breath in the bitter cold, saw a quiet, intimidating ghost. They didn't know she had spent 20 minutes that morning, sitting on the edge of a cheap motel bed, just trying to convince her knees to bend. 5 seconds. The trace hit the apex of its parabolic arc and began its brutal descent. It was falling now. Gravity was sinking its claws in. This was the terrifying part of long-range ballistics. For the last 2,000 meters, the bullet is plummeting out of the sky, bleeding velocity, utterly at the mercy of the wind it is falling through. 7 seconds. She watched the shimmering ripple drift left. Stay there, she thought. Ride the funnel. She didn't shoot because she loved pulling triggers. She hated the noise. She hated the smell of burnt sulfur that never really washed out of her hair. But she loved the math. Mathematics was the only completely honest thing left in her world. People lied. Intelligence reports were fabricated. Politicians changed the rules of engagement on a whim, getting good operators killed for terrible reasons. But a 419 grain bullet flying over a 4,000 meter span was pure, unadulterated consequence. It did exactly what the environment dictated. If you paid attention to the ugly, granular details, the temperature of the dirt, the barometric pressure, the way a silver-backed leaf flipped in the wind, the universe rewarded you with absolute certainty. If you got lazy, it punished you. 9 seconds. The shimmering trace was dropping fast, screaming down toward the dark, jagged backdrop of the canyon wall. It was perfectly aligned with the invisible steel plate. 10 seconds. A microscopic silver flash blossomed on the gray canvas of the steel target. It was utterly silent. The light had arrived, but the sound was still fighting its way back across 2.5 miles of hostile air. Harper didn't move. She kept her eye pressed to the glass, her finger perfectly flat against the trigger shoe. Her breathing was a shallow, controlled hiss through her nose. Beside her, Kinsley inhaled sharply. It sounded like a man who had just nearly drowned, breaking the surface of the water. He was pressed so hard into his spotting scope that the rubber eyepiece was deforming against his brow. "Impact," Kinsley whispered. His voice was completely devoid of its former arrogance. It was hollow, stripped bare, center mass, dead center. 12 seconds. A faint, high-pitched times ping times drifted up the canyon wall. It was a pathetic, metallic sigh, completely stripped of its energy by the vast distance. But to the 13 men standing on the firing line, it was the loudest noise they had ever heard. Nobody cheered. Elite men don't cheer when they've been publicly dismantled. They process, they analyze, they try to find the flaw in the magic trick so they don't have to admit they were just outplayed. The silence on the mountain was heavier than the rifle Harper was currently unshouldering. She rotated the bolt handle up and pulled it back. The massive action slid open with a heavy metallic times shuck. A smoking brass casing, as thick as a roll of quarters, flipped out of the chamber and landed in the dirt next to her cheek. It smelled like sulfur and scorched brass. She didn't pick it up. She left it there in the dust, a permanent marker of a temporary victory. She pushed herself off the packed earth. Her lower back spasmed sharply, a hot wire of pain snapping across her lumbar. She masked it with a tight, involuntary clench of her jaw, rolling onto her knees before standing up. Her combat pants were coated in a fine layer of white limestone dust. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, smearing a mixture of dirt, sweat, and gun oil across her cheekbone. She didn't look like a hero. She looked like a tired mechanic who had just finished pulling a transmission out of a rusted truck. Kinsley stepped back from his spotting scope. He looked pale. He stared at Harper as if she had just materialized out of thin air. "How?" Kinsley asked. The single word hung in the cold air, completely devoid of ego. It was a genuine plea for understanding. Hayes stepped forward, his face flushed a dull, angry red. The wind was pushing right, Finley. The mirage was pushing right. The Kestrel meter was reading right. You held left. That makes zero sense. You just got lucky with a rogue thermal. Harper stopped rolling down her sleeve. She looked at Hayes. Her eyes were dark, flat, and completely exhausted. She didn't feel a rush of triumph. She just felt profoundly tired of men who thought shouting louder made them right. "I didn't get lucky," Harper said, her voice raspy and low. "You were shooting the ground. I was shooting the air." Hayes scowled. "What the hell does that mean?" "You looked at the mirage coming off that granite slab at 2,000 meters, Harper explained, her tone mechanical, like she was reading an after-action report. "Granite holds heat. It creates a microclimate. The mirage you saw was localized convection, boiling off the rock. It wasn't the actual wind vector." She pointed a dirty finger down into the vast, empty valley. "At 3,000 meters, the canyon narrows. Venturi effect. The wind gets sucked into that funnel, pulling back across the flight path. You guys were dialing for a crosswind that only existed for a fraction of the bullet's flight. You overcompensated. The bullet surfed the updraft, hit the funnel, and got pushed exactly where physics demanded it go." Hayes stared at the valley, his jaw tight. He wanted to argue. He desperately wanted to find a variable she had missed, a technicality that would invalidate her read. But the faint, metallic echo of the steel plate was still ringing in his memory. You can't argue with center mass. Donovan, the massive ranger, crossed his arms. "And you saw all that without a spotting scope." "I felt it," Harper said simply. "You guys are so obsessed with your ballistics calculators and your weather meters that you forgot how to actually look at the environment. You're trying to force the bullet to do what you want. You have to let the valley dictate the math." She bent down and grabbed her battered green ammo can. The metal handle clattered loudly in the silence. "The rifle is zeroed," she said, looking at Kinsley. "The barrel is hot. You've got 2 rounds left in the box. Figure it out." She didn't wait for a response. She turned her back on the 13 deadliest snipers in the Western Hemisphere and began walking toward the muddy pickup trucks parked near the tree line. Her boots crunched rhythmically against the gravel. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Every step sent a dull throb up her shins. She wanted a shower, a real shower, with water that didn't smell like bleach and sulfur. She wanted a cup of black coffee that wasn't brewed in a plastic MRE pouch. She wanted to sleep for 3 days. Behind her, she heard the heavy, metallic times, shuck-clack times of the Chatax bolt being worked. Someone was getting back on the mat. Someone was going to try to replicate her math. They would probably miss again. You can't replicate a feeling by just copying the numbers. She reached the tailgate of her truck and tossed the ammo can into the bed. It landed with a hollow, echoing thud. The wind whipped across the ridge, biting through her sweat-dampened shirt. She leaned against the cold metal of the truck, closing her eyes for a brief, stolen second. The headache was coming back, throbbing in time with her pulse. But underneath the pain, underneath the exhaustion and the cynicism, there was a quiet, microscopic kernel of peace. For 10 seconds, the world had made perfect, absolute sense. And for Harper, 10 seconds was enough. Did this story grab you by the throat? The reality of long-range ballistics isn't about Hollywood heroics. It's about gritty, unforgiving physics, raw nerve, and the quiet professionals who master the impossible. If you loved this deep dive into the sensory, deeply human side of military storytelling, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share this video with your crew, and subscribe to the channel for more relentless, grounded stories that pull no punches. We're just getting started.